So, today we're going to be discussing something called the Congress of Vienna and the significance that it has to Britain in the 19th century and in the lifetime of Queen Victoria. One of the things that I'm not really going to be talking too much about over the course of the semester, given the time frame and the virtual nature of it, is sort of international politics. So this is really the one time that I'm going to sort of tread into that. One of the things that's important to see here is that Britain becomes a dominant nation in this period. Now, it doesn't mean that Britain wasn't dominant before and wasn't dominating other pieces of the political spectrum. It just means that Britain really wasn't the dominant power that it would become, let's say, by 1900. So, how is it that Britain gets there? And one of the things that happens is it comes out of the Congress of Vienna, the relatively European piece that happens out of that. So what we're going to be looking at today is the Congress of Vienna. So what is the Congress of Vienna? Many of you will remember, I hope, from other courses, that the French Revolution takes place from 1789 until Napoleon's final defeat in 1815. Napoleon, who comes to power in the late 1790s and ultimately winds up conquering much of Europe, which we'll talk about in just a second, disrupts a lot of the European political spectrums and a lot of the political schemes going on. So what happens as a result is when Napoleon is finally defeated, there needs to be a conversation about how are we going to reestablish Europe. And that's what the Congress of Vienna was. So let's turn our attention to that. Congress of Vienna are a series of meetings that happened between 1814 and 1815, or during those years. And we will be discussing sort of Britain's outcome of that. So this map is a map that's going to show you what Europe was like at the end of Napoleon, or at least in Napoleon's height, right? So this map is from 1812. What I want you to notice here is this, right? The French Empire has expanded pretty well, right? So France, typically the traditional boundaries for France would be sort of where the cursor is moving now. And then you would have what would become Belgium and the Netherlands up here in the north, the Low Countries as they were called. You have the Kingdom of Spain, you have Italy in all its fractured territories. You have Austria, Germany as its sort of smattering of different locations, and then obviously Russia. And we know, I hope you remember, that in 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. He's routed, he's defeated, and has to retreat. And in many ways, that signals sort of the beginning of the end for Napoleon. But it's important to notice here that in all of Europe, whether you're looking at Spain, or really the two dominant places that are not conquered by Napoleon, are Russia and Britain, or I should say the United Kingdom. Portugal is not conquered, but Portugal is not conquered really because it's an ally of Britain, and Britain supports it. So anyway, when Napoleon is defeated the first time, we're not going to get into that, but when Napoleon is defeated the first time, there's a series of meetings held in Vienna, orchestrated most importantly by Metternich. Clemens von Metternich, a name I've mentioned before, is the Chancellor of Austria, and he becomes the dominant figure in the Congress of Vienna as a leader who wants to restore Europe back to the way things were before Napoleon. The other people who are important here, Lord Castlereagh, who is British. You would have seen him in the article. You also know that there's the Duke of Wellington, who is also a major character in these debates, but Castlereagh is really important. Wellington also gets pulled away for other reasons. Hardenberg is from Prussia, what would become Germany, right? The dominant German state at the time. Alexander I of Russia, the Tsar, right? The actual leader, not a deputy of the leaders. And those four are the major ones. France is also involved, although France in many cases is the sort of lesser key figure here. Now, the goal of the Congress of Vienna is to restore stability back to Europe. Now, when we're talking, what that means here is that a couple things. Number one, we want to set up a balance of power. We want to set up a structure where no single figure, no single power can dominate Europe in the same way that Napoleon has just done. We want to make sure that there's a structure where there's no one is too powerful. And in fact, one of the other things is we want to contain that power, particularly if around France. We want to do things to help support places like Germany or Britain to make sure that there's not a single power that can dominate this and contain France. The other major thing here, and I'm going to go back to the map for a second, is restoring legitimacy. Many parts of Europe had been conquered by Napoleon, the King of Spain, the King of the Emperor of Austria. Even the Pope had lost power under Napoleon's reign. So what happens here is that there is an attempt to restore legitimacy, put the people who are legitimately the kings and the queens of Europe back on the throne. So a lot of people, in France, they bring in King Louis XVIII, who is the grandson of Louis XVI, who was beheaded in the French Revolution. This, in many ways, is a conservative movement. Now, one of the things that's going to be a conversation that we're going to have in British politics is liberal versus conservative. This is not the same thing that it means in the 21st century. In the 19th century, liberal meant, and I'll get to conservatism in just a second, liberal meant fighting for individual liberty, fighting for the rights of the people, freedom of the press, freedom of limited democracy, property rights. Those would be being able to criticize the monarchy. That would have been sort of a liberal perspective. A conservative perspective, on the other hand, at this time meant really focusing on the wealthy. Aristocracy was key. Rights of land ownership to the nobility. Supporting the monarchy, and a strong monarchy. Supporting an established church, not freedom of religion like the liberals would want. So the Congress of Vienna is a conservative movement. It's really looking to squash down liberal ideas. And these liberal ideas had moved throughout Europe because of the French Revolution, because Napoleon took the ideas of nationalism and state pride and access to education with him as he moved. These ideas continue to spread and become more popular. One of the big things that happens in the Congress of Vienna is a rise of nationalism. Now, what happens in here is sort of two things. Nationalism gets broken apart here, but I want to focus first on the conservative aspect of this. One of the things that happens here is countries like Austria, Germany, or Prussia, France, Britain to an extent, and Russia experience a swelling of nationalism, right? This sort of, particularly for the British and the Russians, we were not conquered by Napoleon. Prussia, Austria, you were. We are the ones who weren't. So we should get the dominant aspects here. And that's true. So when they come to these negotiations, right, they had been a wartime coalition. The Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, and the British had all fought to try and get rid of Napoleon. But here we are now. Napoleon has been exiled, and that coalition has dissolved. What we want now is to focus on our protection and our supremacy. There's also another piece to this. The people in Italy, the people in Austria, the people in Russia, average people are feeling like, wait a second, we just had a French guy controlling us. How how did that happen? We want rulers who look like us, speak like us. And there's a growing sort of lower group of nationalism, right? So we have sort of, if you want to think of it as the meta nationalism that the British, Castlereagh and Talleyrand and Alexander the First and all these guys are experiencing. But then there's sort of let's say, a sub nationalism, a micro nationalism, where people within Europe are saying, we don't want somebody else like that. And this is going to push countries together 30 years later, right? So Germany did not exist as Germany that we know of it today. Germany was a whole bunch of different broken up principalities. Prussia was the dominant figure, but this pushes them together. Same would be true in Italy. But this would also be true for sort of pieces of the Balkans and other places. The other major thing to come out of this, though, is that there's this idea of compensation. There needs to be a compensation to the places that were greatest damage, right? So Germany gets a piece of land that's along the Rhine River. One of the things that's going to happen here is Germany is going to start advocating that Germans are going to start advocating that we are German, we are not French. And this is going to push people together, a coalescing of Germanness. And how do we define Germanness? Yes, you may live near the French border and you may speak a different dialect, but you are German. So this is going to bring people together, and ultimately, in the 1870s, we get the state of Germany. Russia and Britain come into the Congress of Vienna, and ultimately they come out of the Congress of Vienna in much differently than Prussia and Austria. And the reason is Britain and Russia sacrificed a lot to beat Napoleon. Russia had extraordinary manpower. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the industry, but they had manpower, and they threw that at the war. So millions of Russians die fighting Napoleon. For Britain, they didn't necessarily sacrifice a huge number of people, but instead what Britain had is industrial power. They had the best navy in the world and the best and the best fighting force of the world. So Britain really could help get rid of Napoleon, and we ultimately know that Admiral Nelson defeats Napoleon finally at Waterloo, right? So anyway, it's Britain and Russia can sort of negotiate for a lot because they are the two most powerful. But that's also going to create tension among Britain and Russia because they are they're the two strongest powers, right? Russia's got the men, Britain's got the manpower, and that this will create tension, right? And one of the things that's going to happen here is, again, there's going to be Britain focusing on itself. So this is what ultimately happens out of this. The German Confederation emerges out of the Congress of Vienna, the sort of first attempt at German unification. You get sort of this dual monarchy in Austria. You get Austria, what would become Austria-Hungary, right? You get these. Italy is France is very concerned about what's going to happen in Italy. Austria is very concerned about what's going to happen in Italy. So that's part of the negotiations as well. So the effects of this is there's general peace around Europe. For the next 100-ish years, there's no real major European war. Yeah, there's smaller wars. There's going to be revolutions in the 1840s. There's going to be fighting in France for the next 50 years. There's going to be a war between Prussia and France that will push Germany together. There will be small regional wars, but there will not be a large war until World War I. So the Congress of Vienna really ignites this quest towards nationalism, and